Banff Park is a bit of an exception in many ways. Often when you think of a national park, you don't think of having the Trans-Canada Highway traveling right through the middle of it.
Through the 1970s and 1980s, we had quite high ungulate populations, and ungulate being deer and elk and moose through Banff National Park. And unfortunately, this is where a lot of those animals ended up dying, was right along the highway. You hit an animal that weighs 600 or 700 pounds, something the size of an elk, and perhaps it flips up and makes contact with your windshield. You know, the potential for serious injury to people is very real. The death to the animal is obvious, and so it was a really bad situation.
There are 6 overpass structures being built between the East Gate and the Alberta-BC border, so the entire portion of Banff National Park. These are a large sort of 2 culverts that allow cars to travel through them, and it's an earth-filled structure over top so that wildlife can actually travel right over top of the highway.
The idea is that as wildlife come along and they're guided into this area by the fencing, that this will be just a natural part of their environment. When structures are first put in place, some wildlife, particularly the wary species, some of the carnivores that are a little more shy, they take time to adapt. They take time to learn where those crossing structures are and whether or not they're safe. They kind of sniff around and they check it out, but once they use them for the first time and they realize they're successful, they keep coming back.
We monitor the crossing structures, and one of the ways we do that is through the use of infrared remote triggered cameras.
We're at the point now where we see animals that are crossing with their young. We'll see a female bear that'll cross with her cubs, and then later on, 4 or 5 years later, we know those same cubs, we'll see those cubs using it on their own.
The crossing structures that are used in Banff National Park are held up as an example around the world. Several years ago, I was attending a conference in Oregon looking at human disturbance and wildlife impacts, and there was a fellow presenting on the Florida panther, and his last slide in his presentation was actually an aerial photo of one of the Banff overpasses, and he was holding this up as something they were hopeful to be able to implement in Florida.
Some species like black bears and cougars, they like the darker, narrower underpasses. But some species like elk and grizzly bears in particular, and wolves, they prefer the more open style of overpass structures. We try and just stay as objective as we can and not have a close level of attachment to a particular animal. But you know, that can be difficult, that can be challenging, you know, when you come to know an animal. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to have that level of attachment. It certainly motivates us and the staff around here to work as hard as we can to make sure that we keep that animal alive on the landscape. We're at the point now where we've reduced wildlife collisions by over 80%.
Here in Banff, we're fairly proud that Parks Canada has been able to turn this exception into the exceptional.